The wind came down from the Bighorn Mountains with the sound of a grieving animal, a long, hollow cry that swept across the vast, empty plains of the Wyoming Territory. It was a frigid evening in the autumn of 1885, the kind of cold that went straight through a man's coat and settled deep in his bones. The sky was a bruise of purple and angry orange, the last light of the sun clinging weakly to the horizon before surrendering to the encroaching dark. Against this bruised canvas, the mountains were skeletal silhouettes, ancient and indifferent. The very air was thin and sharp, carrying on its breath the clear, cruel promise of an early and brutal winter. Inside the grand ranch house of Silas Croft, the air was thick with the fug of whiskey, cigar smoke, and expensive perfume. The celebration was winding down. Elara stood near a tall window, her body trembling inside an ornate wedding dress that felt more like a cage than a garment. It was fashioned from Parisian lace and Belgian silk, with 1,000 tiny seed pearls sewn into the bodice, and it was suffocatingly tight, each whalebone stay a reminder of her binding. She was barely 20, and tonight she had become Mrs. Silas Croft. From her vantage point, she could see the last of the guests departing, their carriages rattling away into the immense darkness. Their smiles had been as stiff and artificial as the silk flowers arranged in heavy vases throughout the house. They had offered their congratulations with eyes that held a mixture of envy and pity. Envy for the wealth and power she had married into, and pity for the man she had married. Silas was the most powerful man in the territory, his land holdings stretching farther than a man could ride in 2 days, his cattle herds beyond counting. He was also the most feared. He stood across the room now, talking to his foreman, a brutish man named Jebediah. Silas was a handsome man in a severe, chiseled way, with eyes the color of a frozen pond and a mouth that rarely curved into a genuine smile. He held his whiskey glass with a proprietary air, as if he owned the very amber liquid within it. He owned everything: the land, the cattle, the house, the men who worked for him, and now, her. He glanced over at her, and his gaze was not that of a loving new husband, but of a predator assessing his catch. His hand, which had gripped her arm throughout the reception in a display of what the guests saw as affection, had left a deep ache in its wake. She could feel the phantom pressure of his fingers, a grip that was less an embrace and more a branding. Her terror was a cold, living thing in the pit of her stomach. It was not a fear of the unknown future, but of the very known, calculated cruelty she had witnessed in the weeks since her father, a man broken by drought and debt, had arranged this match. She had seen the way Silas's eyes went flat and dead when he was displeased. A memory, sharp and chilling, rose unbidden in her mind. Just last week, in the stables, a young hand had made a minor mistake, saddling the wrong horse. Silas had not raised his voice. He had simply walked over to the boy and, with a swift, economical motion, struck him across the face. The sound had been a sickening crack, and the boy had crumpled to the ground, blood streaming from his lip. Silas had looked down at him for a long moment, his expression utterly blank, devoid of anger or any other human emotion. It was the detached coldness of his cruelty that terrified her most. That, she knew, was what awaited her behind the closed doors of their life together. "Leave us," Silas said to Jebediah, his voice a low rumble that cut through the remaining din of the servants clearing away glasses. Jebediah gave Elara a look of smug contempt before turning and leaving the grand room. The silence that descended was more menacing than the noise had been. Silas crossed the room, his boots making a heavy, deliberate sound on the polished oak floors. He stopped before her, his nearness overwhelming. He smelled of whiskey and something else, something sharp and possessive. "The guests are gone. It is time for us to retire to the bridal chamber. Wife." The word wife was a stone on his tongue, a statement of fact and ownership. He led her up the grand, curving staircase to the master suite, a room so lavishly appointed it felt like a showroom. A massive 4-poster bed dominated the space, its crimson draperies like curtains on a grim stage. He closed the door behind them, the click of the latch sounding as final as a cell door locking. He cornered her then, his large frame blocking the only exit. His voice was low, menacing, a conspiratorial whisper that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. You should know my expectations. I expect obedience in all things. I expect my home to be run with efficiency. And I expect you to be fertile. You will give me sons to inherit all of this. He gestured vaguely at the opulent room, at the empire he had built. He laid a hand on her cheek, his fingers cold against her skin. The touch was not one of love, not even of desire. It was the touch of a rancher checking his livestock, assessing the quality of his acquisition. A wave of pure, primal revulsion washed over her, so powerful it made her gag. This could not be her life. She could not submit to this man, to this cold, empty existence where she would be nothing more than a vessel for his heirs and a beautiful object to display. Survival, a deep, instinctual need for it, screamed through her. She feigned a sudden weakness, her mind working with a desperate clarity. Her hand went to her forehead. "Oh," she whispered, her voice trembling convincingly. "I feel quite unwell. The room is spinning." She allowed her knees to buckle slightly, leaning against him just enough to make her swoon seem real. For a moment, he did not move, his frozen eyes searching her face for deceit. Then, a look of contemptuous impatience crossed his features. "Useless," he muttered under his breath. He turned his back on her, striding over to a decanter of water on a nearby table. "A little water, and then you will perform your duty." That moment, that single instant when his back was turned, was all she had. It was a sliver of an opening, a crack in the wall of her prison, and she threw herself at it with the desperation of a drowning woman. There was no plan, no thought beyond escape. Adrenaline, sharp and potent, flooded her veins. With a savage, ripping sound, she tore at the expensive lace hem of her dress, shredding the bottom half of the gown to free her legs. The impractical satin shoes were kicked off, skittering across the floor. She did not hesitate. She ran to the large side window, fumbled with the latch, and pushed it open. The frigid night air was a shock, a slap in the face, but it was the breath of freedom. She slipped out the window, dropping the short distance to the frozen, sharp earth below. Her bare feet screamed in protest as they met the ground, but she did not stop. She ran. She ran blindly, driven by pure instinct, away from the golden lights of the Croft Ranch, away from the man who was her husband, and into the vast, swallowing darkness of the plains. The sounds of the party, which had seemed so loud and oppressive just moments before, faded into the roaring of the wind. Her own ragged breathing filled her ears, a frantic, painful rhythm. She stumbled over rocks and through thorny sagebrush, her torn dress catching and ripping, her feet bleeding. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to get away. The darkness was absolute, a thick black velvet that pressed in from all sides. The howling wind was her only companion, and it seemed to mock her, to tear at her with icy claws. Time lost all meaning. It could have been minutes or an eternity. She ran until her lungs burned with a fiery pain, until the muscles in her legs screamed in agony, until her body was shaking so violently from cold and fear that she could barely stay upright. She would run, stumble, fall to the hard ground, and crawl behind a rock outcropping, her body heaving with silent, terrified sobs. Then the fear of being caught would overwhelm the pain, and she would force herself back to her feet and run again. Finally, just as she felt her last ounce of strength failing, she saw it, a single, faint point of light in the distance. It was a lantern, hanging from a post, its yellow glow a tiny beacon in the endless black. It illuminated a small, isolated homestead, a modest cabin and a sturdy-looking barn, seeming like the last outpost of civilization before the wilderness took over completely. Hope, or perhaps just the last vestiges of her will to survive, gave her a final burst of energy. She staggered towards the light, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated. She reached the edge of the property, her body swaying with exhaustion. Her first instinct was to avoid the cabin, fearing who might be inside. fearing that anyone in this desolate place must be in league with a man like Silas Croft. The barn, however, offered a different kind of sanctuary. Darkness, anonymity. She slipped through the slightly ajar door into the profound blackness within. The change in atmosphere was immediate and overwhelming. The smell of hay, dust, and the warm, living scent of animals filled her nostrils. It was an earthy, honest smell, a world away from the cloying perfume and cigar smoke of her wedding. She collapsed into a pile of loose hay, the soft, dry stalks a welcome cushion for her battered body. The tears she had been holding back finally came, silent sobs that shook her frame, her mind convinced that the sound of hounds and angry men would break the night's silence at any moment. The owner of the homestead, Caleb, was in his cabin, preparing to turn in for the night. He was a man in his late 20s, though the harshness of the land and a deep, abiding sadness in his eyes made him seem older. He was lean and strong, his body honed to a wiry toughness by years of hard, solitary work. His skin was weathered by sun and wind, and his movements were quiet and deliberate, marked by a weary purpose that spoke of a life lived on the fringes, in the nearest town, a place he avoided whenever possible. He was known simply as the half-breed who kept to himself, a man who belonged to neither the world of the white settlers nor the world of his Shoshone mother. His small cabin was Spartan, containing only what was necessary for survival, a reflection of a man who had stripped his life down to its barest essentials. Before sleeping, he always checked on his livestock. It was a routine born of habit and necessity in a land where a lame horse or a sick cow could mean the difference between survival and starvation. He pulled on his worn sheepskin coat, took up his lantern, and walked the short distance from his cabin to the barn. He pushed the heavy wooden door open, the lantern light cutting a wide, golden swath through the darkness. Instantly, he knew something was wrong. It was a feeling more than a sound or a sight, a subtle disturbance in the familiar peace of his barn. His horse, a steady buckskin gelding, nickered softly from its stall, a nervous, questioning sound. Caleb's senses, honed by a lifetime of solitude and self-reliance, went on high alert. He stood perfectly still for a moment, listening, his eyes scanning the shadows. He moved forward with a cautious, silent grace, not with aggression, but with the innate watchfulness of a man who always expected trouble. The lantern light swept across the hay piled in the corner, and he saw a flash of white. He moved closer, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of the knife he always wore at his belt. And then he saw her. She was huddled in the hay, a broken doll in a ruined white dress, stained with mud and what looked like blood. Her face, pale and tear-streaked in the flickering light, was turned towards him, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it made him pause. She looked like a broken angel who had fallen from the bruised sky and landed in the dust and straw of his world. Her immediate reaction was to flinch away, to scramble backward into the hay, her hands coming up as if to ward off a blow. The gesture was one of ingrained fear, of expecting violence as a certainty. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the soft stamp of the horse in its stall and the whistling of the wind outside the barn walls. Finally, she found her voice. It was a raw, desperate whisper, a sound scraped from the very bottom of her soul. "They're coming for me tonight." She did not say who they were. She did not need to. The terror that radiated from her was explanation enough. Caleb's reaction was not what she expected. There was no anger, no shouting, no immediate demand for an explanation. He simply stood there, studying her with his steady, unreadable gaze. His eyes took in the whole scene, the ridiculously expensive dress, now torn and filthy, the dark, ugly bruises already forming on her pale arm where someone had gripped her too tightly, the raw, animal fear in her eyes. Caleb was a man who recognized suffering because he had lived his entire life with it as a close companion. He harbored a deep, ingrained distrust of the wealthy and the powerful, especially men like Silas Croft, whose reputation for ruthlessness was known even out here on the lonely fringes of the territory. Then he heard it, a faint sound carried on the wind, but one that his sharp ears could not miss, the distant, frantic baying of dogs, Croft's hunting hounds. The search had already begun. The threat was not some future possibility, it was real and it was immediate. Without a word, Caleb raised his lantern, gesturing upwards towards the dark square of the hayloft opening. He reached down and took her arm, his touch firm but not rough. He pulled her to her feet and guided her towards the ladder. He pulled her into the hayloft. The space above was small and close, filled with the clean, dry scent of cut grass. The wind whistled through the cracks in the wooden walls, a constant, mournful sound. The intimacy of the small space was suffocating. Caleb moved quickly, finding a spot for her in the deepest, darkest corner of the loft. He burrowed her down into the hay, piling it around her until she was almost completely concealed. He found a rough wool blanket folded on a nearby stack and handed it to her. "Be silent," he said, his voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night. He did not hide with her. Instead, he positioned himself near the edge of the loft, where he could look down on the barn floor below. He picked up a pitchfork that was leaning against a post. He held it not like a farmer, but like a man would hold a spear, a tool of defense. He was not a hero looking for a fight. He was a man protecting the sanctity of his home, the quiet solitude which she had so thoroughly invaded. They did not have to wait long. The sound of hoofbeats and barking dogs grew louder, culminating in a clatter of noise in his yard. Torchlight flickered erratically through the cracks in the barn walls. Alara held her breath, pressing herself deeper into the hay, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure they could hear it. This was it. She was found. "Hello, the barn!" a rough voice shouted. The main barn door was kicked open with a loud bang, and a group of men spilled inside, their torches flooding the space below with a dancing, menacing light. There were 4 of them, led by the foreman, Jebediah. They were loud, arrogant, and moved with the casual violence of men who were used to getting their way through intimidation. Caleb remained perfectly still in the darkness above, a silent shadow watching them. "Anyone in here?" Jebediah bellowed, his voice echoing in the rafters. After a moment, Caleb swung himself down the ladder, landing silently on the barn floor. He stood before them, a solitary, quiet figure against the backdrop of his own home. "What do you want?" Caleb's voice was even, giving nothing away. Jebediah swaggered forward, looking Caleb up and down with open disdain. "We're looking for something, belonging to Mr. Croft. You seen a woman? In a wedding dress, of all things?" He sneered. "I have seen no one," Caleb said, his face a stony mask. The foreman was clearly suspicious. Men like Jebediah did not trust quiet men, especially not a reclusive half-breed. He stepped closer, trying to use his larger size to intimidate Caleb. "You sure about that? There's a mighty big reward for her return, and a whole lot of trouble for anyone who helps her hide." He gave Caleb a hard shove, trying to provoke a reaction, to find an excuse for violence. Caleb did not react with anger. He absorbed the shove, his body unyielding as an old oak. His eyes, cold and steady, met the foreman's. "I have seen no one," he repeated, his voice flat and final. His quiet defiance was more powerful than any outburst could ever be. It unnerved Jebediah. The foreman, though brutish, was not entirely stupid. He sensed a danger in Caleb's stillness, a deep, coiled strength that warned him that pushing this man too far without proof could be a deadly mistake. His men made a cursory search of the barn's lower level, kicking over buckets and prodding hay bales with their rifle barrels. They found nothing. From outside, a whistle blew, a signal from another search party. "Come on," one of the men grumbled. "She ain't here." Jebediah shot one last, venomous look at Caleb. "If we find out you're lying, we'll be back, and we will burn this place to the ground with you inside it." They left, their threats and curses swallowed by the wind as they rode off into the darkness. After they were gone, Caleb did not move. He stood in the middle of the barn floor for a long time, listening to the silence, making sure they were truly gone and not circling back. The only sound was the settling of the barn and the relentless cry of the wind. Finally, he climbed back into the hayloft. He found Alara exactly where he had left her, a trembling mound in the hay. She was shivering uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the aftermath of sheer terror. He pulled out his canteen, unstoppered it, and offered it to her. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if approaching a spooked animal. She took it with shaking hands and drank the cool water greedily. The part ended there, in the tense silence of the loft. There was no resolution, only a temporary reprieve. A fragile, unspoken truce had been forged between them in the heat of fear and the cold of the night. She was safe, for now. And he, for reasons he did not fully understand himself, had chosen to protect her. They were two strangers, a runaway bride and a reclusive outcast, bound together in the suffocating intimacy of the hayloft, with the vast, dangerous wilderness waiting outside and the threat of a powerful enemy promising to return with the dawn. The first light of dawn was not a promise, but a warning. It filtered through the cracks in the barn walls in thin, gray, dusty bars, painting the hayloft in shades of ash. The cold of the night had given way to the even deeper, more desolate cold of the pre-dawn hours. The immediate threat of Jebediah and his men had passed, but the tension they had left behind lingered in the air, as tangible as the frost that silvered the rough-hewn timbers. Alara had not slept. Each time she had drifted towards the edge of exhaustion, a nightmare would pull her back, her mind replaying the moment in the bridal chamber, the cold weight of Silas's hand, the deadness in his eyes. She had lain curled in the hay, the rough wool blanket clutched to her chin, listening to the ceaseless monologue of the wind and the slow, steady rhythm of the breathing of the man who sat watch in the darkness a few feet away. Caleb had not moved from his position at the edge of the loft. He was a silent, brooding figure, a part of the shadows, his stillness more unnerving than any anxious pacing might have been. He had watched the darkness fade, his thoughts turning over the problem she represented. He knew men like Silas Croft. They did not forgive, and they did not forget. Pride was their god, and she had committed the ultimate blasphemy. Croft's men would be back with the full light of day, and this time they would not be so easily turned away. They would be more thorough. They would tear his small homestead apart, board by board, until they found what they were looking for. He could not keep her here. The thought of turning her out, a lone woman in rags, into the unforgiving wilderness was just as impossible. As the gray light strengthened, he finally broke the long silence. "You cannot stay." His voice, low and rough from the night's vigil, made her jump. She sat up, clutching the blanket, her eyes wide and fearful in the dim light. "Where will I go?" she whispered, the question laced with a despair that was absolute. Caleb looked at her, his gaze direct and unsparing. "They will be back. When the sun is up, they will search this place properly, and they will find you." He paused, letting the grim reality of his words settle. He was not a man given to grand gestures or speeches of reassurance. His life had taught him that the world responded only to practical, decisive action. He possessed a core of deep-seated integrity, a quiet moral compass that the world had done its best to break, but had never quite succeeded. "I will not give you to them, but you cannot stay here." He made his decision in that moment, or perhaps it had been made for him the instant he heard the hounds baying in the night. He would take the trouble she had brought and move it off his land. Move it far away. It was the only logical thing to do. That is what he told himself. "North," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We will go north, through the Owl Creek Mountains. There is a Shoshone reservation on the other side. You might find a way to disappear from there. Find a path to somewhere he cannot easily reach." He framed it as a practical choice, a simple matter of removing a problem. But in the quiet intensity of his gaze, she saw something else, something deeper. an unspoken protectiveness that was as solid and unyielding as the man himself. Ilara, weak from hunger and exhaustion, her body a tapestry of aches and bruises, could only nod. She had no other choice. This quiet, somber stranger was the only thing standing between her and Silas. She would follow him into the jaws of the wilderness itself if she had to. Their preparations were swift and practical, conducted in the silent, purposeful atmosphere of people who knew time was their enemy. Caleb climbed down from the loft and returned a few minutes later from his cabin. He carried a small bundle of clothes and a pair of worn leather boots. He handed them to her without ceremony. "These will be better for travel," he said, his eyes averted, as if the intimacy of the gesture embarrassed him. The clothes were simple and durable, a pair of men's trousers made of heavy canvas and patched at one knee, a dark blue wool shirt, soft from countless washings. They were clean, but they held the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke and a life that was not her own. She did not ask who they had belonged to. The faint, almost imperceptible shadow of pain that crossed his face as he handed them to her was answer enough. A wife, perhaps, or a sister, a ghost from the tragic past his sad eyes hinted at. In the cold privacy of a horse stall, Ilara shed the ruined wedding dress. The silk and lace felt like a snake's skin, a remnant of a life she was desperate to leave behind. It was a shroud, and she left it in a heap on the dusty floor. The act of pulling on the practical clothes was deeply symbolic, a transformation. She was shedding the identity of Ilara Croft, the prized possession, the trembling bride, the new identity. However, was a frightening blank. The clothes were far too big for her. The sleeves of the shirt had to be rolled up, and the trousers were held up only by a piece of rope Caleb had given her for a belt. She looked like a child playing dress-up, but the heavy wool was warm, and the sturdy trousers and boots offered a sense of anonymity and readiness that the silk dress never could have. They left before the sun had fully risen, two small figures slipping away into the vast, gray landscape. Caleb had 2 horses, but he saddled only his buckskin gelding. "We will ride double," he explained. "We will move faster, and leave only one set of tracks." He swung up into the saddle, then reached a hand down to her. His grip was strong and calloused, and he pulled her up behind him with an easy strength that surprised her. The landscape they entered was a character in itself, as harsh and unforgiving as the man she had fled. They traversed vast, empty sagebrush flats, the ground frozen solid, ringing like iron under the horses' hooves. The wind was a constant, physical presence, a relentless bully that whipped at their clothes, stole the warmth from their bodies, and filled their ears with its mournful howl. Caleb's knowledge of this brutal land was evident in every choice he made. He did not ride in a straight line, but wove a path that followed the rocky, gravelly ground where their tracks would be harder to read. He kept to the low ground, using the rolling hills and shallow ravines to keep them from being silhouetted against the ever-brightening skyline. He rode with a quiet focus, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his body attuned to the subtle language of the wilderness. Their initial interactions were as sparse and functional as the landscape itself. He was entirely focused on the mechanics of survival, and she was lost in a fog of shock and fear. The physical intimacy of their situation was both awkward and profoundly charged. To keep from falling off the horse, she had to hold on to him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her body pressed against the solid wall of his back. Through the layers of their clothes, she could feel his warmth, the subtle shift of his muscles as he guided the horse. She was intensely aware of him, of the simple, clean scent of leather, wood smoke, and the cold morning air that clung to him. For Caleb, her presence was a constant, unnerving intrusion into the carefully constructed solitude of his world. She was a tangible reminder of the society he had turned his back on, a world of powerful men and helpless victims that he had tried so desperately to forget. Back at the Croft Ranch, Silas stood before the massive stone fireplace in his study. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. But it brought no warmth to the room. His rage was not the hot, explosive anger of a common man. It was a cold, deep, terrifying fury, the anger of a king whose authority has been flouted. Ilara was not a lost love he mourned. She was a stolen prize, a public, humiliating defiance of his will. She had not just run from him, she had made him look like a fool in front of the entire territory. Jebediah stood before him, his hat held nervously in his hands. He had reported the failure of the night's search, including the encounter with the quiet man in the isolated homestead. "A half-breed, you say?" Silas asked, his voice deceptively calm. He swirled the brandy in his glass, his frozen eyes fixed on the liquid. "Yes, sir. Caleb is his name. Lives out there alone. Claimed he saw nothing." "And you believed him?" Jebediah shifted his weight. He is a hard man to read, sir. But his place was the only shelter for miles in the direction she was headed." Silas took a slow sip of his brandy. He did not look at his foreman. "I do not pay you to read men, Jebediah. I pay you to find things. You have failed me." He placed the glass down on the mantelpiece with a soft, deliberate click. "Find her. I want every man we have out searching. I want every trail, every ravine, every homestead between here and the mountains checked. I am offering a bounty, $500 for her return." Jebediah's eyes widened at the sum. It was a fortune. "And," Silas continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming as cold and sharp as a sliver of ice, "I am offering $1,000 for the man who helped her. I want him brought to me, alive. I will deal with him myself." He finally turned his gaze on his foreman, and the raw, controlled violence in his eyes made the brutish man take an involuntary step back. Silas Croft was not just a husband looking for his wife, he was a tyrant reclaiming his property, and he would unleash all of his considerable resources, his money, his men, and his influence, to see it done. The first day on the run was a grueling test of endurance. Caleb pushed the horse, and himself, and by extension, Ilara, to the very limits. They stopped only once, briefly, in the shelter of a rocky outcropping, to rest the horse and eat. The meal was as grim as their circumstances, strips of tough, salty jerky and squares of hardtack that scraped the throat. The water from Caleb's canteen was metallic and lukewarm. Ilara, who had never known a day of true physical hardship in her life, struggled terribly. Every muscle in her body ached from the unaccustomed rigors of riding. Her bare feet, which she had naively thought were numb, were now a source of searing pain inside the ill-fitting boots, the raw skin rubbing and blistering with every step she took on the hard ground. The relentless cold had seeped deep into her bones, and she could not stop shivering. Late in the afternoon, as they were navigating a steep, rocky wash, she stumbled. Her ankle turned on a loose stone, and she fell to the ground with a cry of pain and frustration. And she did not get up. She lay there, huddled on the frozen earth, overwhelmed by exhaustion, pain, and a sudden, crushing wave of despair. It was all too much. The running, the fear, the cold, the endless, empty landscape. Tears of helplessness froze on her cheeks. Caleb stopped the horse and turned. He looked down at the crumpled figure on the ground. A flicker of impatience might have been expected, a sharp word to get her moving again. But it did not come. Instead, he dismounted and walked back to her. He stood over her for a long moment, and for the first time, he seemed to be truly seeing her, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person at the very end of her rope. He saw her vulnerability, her utter exhaustion, and the flicker of a fighting spirit nearly extinguished. Without a word, he knelt beside her. He gently took her foot and, with a touch that was unexpectedly careful, pulled off the heavy boot. Her foot was a mess of raw blisters and angry red skin. He took a strip of clean cloth from his saddlebag, wet it with a little of his precious water, and gently cleaned the worst of the grime away. His touch was firm, but gentle, his calloused fingers surprisingly deft. It was a small act, a moment of simple human decency in the midst of their desperate flight, and it was the first crack in his stoic facade. He shared a little more of his water with her, letting her drink from the canteen. When he was done, he looked her straight in the eye. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of hard-earned truth. "The mountains do not care if you are tired," he said. "They will kill you just the same." It was not meant to be cruel. It was a lesson. The first and most important lesson of survival in this land. There was no room for pity, only for resolve. She looked back at him, her tears subsiding, and she understood. She nodded, and with his help, she got back to her feet. As night fell, they were forced to make a cold camp. They found a small, sheltered coulee, a deep scar in the earth that offered some protection from the incessant wind. A fire was out of the question. The smoke would be a beacon, giving away their position for miles. The temperature plummeted with the setting of the sun, and the cold became a real and present danger. They ate another meager meal in silence, and then Caleb spread their single blanket on the ground. "We will have to share the warmth," he said, the words purely practical, yet they hung in the frigid air with an undeniable weight. The proximity was no longer just the awkward necessity of riding on a horse, it was a desperate, essential act of survival. They lay down side by side, pulling the blanket over them, their breath misting in the freezing air. They huddled together, her back pressed against his chest, his arm around her, a purely functional embrace against the killing cold. In the profound darkness, surrounded by the immense silence of the plains, a false sense of security began to settle over Alara. The immediate fear of pursuit had faded, replaced by the dull ache of exhaustion. And in that quiet space, the words she had held inside began to spill out. She started to talk, her voice low and halting at first, then gaining strength as she unburdened herself. She told him about Silas. She did not speak of the grand cruelties, but of the small, specific, chilling ones. She described his obsession with appearances, how everything had to be perfect, a reflection of his own power and control. She told him how Silas would isolate her, subtly turning friends and even her own family against her with his quiet manipulations. She described the way he would belittle her in private, his words like tiny, sharp knives designed to carve away her confidence, to make her feel small and utterly dependent on him. It was not an exposition of facts. It was a confession, a desperate need to have her experience validated, to have someone else know that the monster she had fled was real. Caleb listened in silence, his body rigid behind her. He did not interrupt, did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply listened, and his stillness was a form of acceptance, of belief. Her story, the story of a powerful man crushing a person he considered his property, resonated with the deepest, most painful parts of his own past. When she finally fell silent, her voice choked with emotion, he spoke. His own voice was quiet and grim in the darkness. "Men like Croft," he said, "they do not build things. They just own them, people included." It was a moment of profound connection, a quiet recognition of a shared understanding of the world's casual injustices. He understood. He truly understood. Their fragile moment of intimacy was shattered by a sound, the distant but unmistakable jingle of a harness, the soft thud of horse hooves on the frozen ground. Riders. Instantly, Caleb was on alert. He pressed a hand over her mouth, a silent command for absolute stillness. He held the muzzle of his horse, keeping the animal from making a sound. They pressed themselves flat against the bottom of the coulee, trying to melt into the shadows, into the frozen earth itself. The patrol sent by Silas passed along the ridge of the coulee, so close that Alara could hear the low murmur of their voices, the creak of saddle leather. She could smell the smoke from their cigarettes. Her heart pounded in her throat. A wild, trapped bird. She was certain they would be seen, that a stray beam of moonlight would betray them. The moments stretched into an eternity. Then, the sounds began to fade as the riders continued on their way, a sweeping patrol combing the vast, empty plains. Long after they were gone, Caleb and Alara remained frozen in place, huddled together in the darkness. The immediate danger had passed once again, but the vast, cold wilderness stretched before them, and they now knew for certain that the hunters were no longer behind them, but all around them. The fragile trust that had begun to form between them had been forged into something stronger in the heat of that shared terror. They were no longer just a man helping a woman. They were partners in a desperate gamble for her life. Ilara, shivering in his arms, felt something shift inside her. For the first time, it was not the cold flicker of hope she felt, but something more fundamental, more powerful, the hot, defiant will to fight, not just to flee. And Caleb, a man who thought his heart was as frozen and barren as the land around him, felt an unwelcome and profoundly dangerous thaw beginning. The plains gave way to the foothills, and the foothills reared up into the jagged, formidable spine of the Owl Creek Mountains. The days that followed their flight from the coulee blurred into a relentless cycle of riding, hiding, and enduring. The sun was a distant, indifferent observer, its light offering little warmth as they pushed ever northward, ever upward. The landscape grew more formidable with each passing mile, a place of raw, majestic beauty that was also profoundly dangerous. They rode along narrow, treacherous game trails that clung to the sides of sheer granite cliffs, where a single misstep by the horse would send them plunging into the abyss below. They picked their way through dense pine forests that were so thick they swallowed the daylight, creating a perpetual twilight where every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The silence in those woods was absolute, broken only by the sighing of the wind in the high branches and the soft tread of their horse on a carpet of fallen needles. The beauty of the wilderness was a constant, cruel temptation, offering moments of awe that were always tempered by the harsh reality of their situation. One afternoon, they came upon a crystalline waterfall, a breathtaking cascade of silver water tumbling over a series of moss-covered ledges into a turquoise pool. But its beauty was a lie. It was the source of a fast-flowing, freezing creek they were forced to cross, the icy water a shocking, painful assault that left their legs numb and their resolve shaken. Another morning, after a grueling climb, they reached a high ridge that offered a stunning vista, a panoramic view of the world spread out at their feet, a tapestry of green forests and gray rock under a vast, empty sky. But the vista also exposed them, making them feel small and terribly visible, and they hurried down into the relative safety of the valleys, knowing that any pair of eyes with a spyglass could have seen them for miles. The physical toll of the journey deepened, settling into a permanent ache in their bones. Their meager rations of jerky and hardtack dwindled until there was nothing left but a few crumbs in the bottom of a saddlebag. Hunger, which had been a dull, background ache, became a sharp, demanding presence. Caleb was forced to rely on the skills that had kept him alive during his years of solitude. He began to carry a length of wire with him, and at each stop, he would disappear into the undergrowth to set snares along the rabbit runs he found. The process was described to Ilara in unsentimental, practical detail. He showed her how to find the trails, how to fashion the loop, how to use a bent sapling to create the tension. The first time he returned to their cold camp with a snared rabbit, its life ended by a swift, efficient twist of his hands. Ilara felt a wave of nausea, the small, still form, the soft, lifeless fur. It was a visceral reminder of the brutal necessities of this new world she inhabited. But later, as the smell of the meat roasting over a tiny, carefully concealed fire filled the air, the sharp pangs of hunger quickly overcame her squeamishness. She ate her share ravenously, the simple, savory meat the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. It was another lesson, another piece of her old self stripped away and replaced by the brutal pragmatism of survival. Their emotional intimacy grew not in grand declarations, but in the small, quiet moments that punctuated their relentless forward motion. It grew in the shared silence as they rode, a comfortable quiet that had replaced the awkward tension of their first days together. It grew in the way he would pass her the canteen without her having to ask, and the way she would instinctively gather dry tinder for a fire she knew they could not risk lighting. They were becoming a unit, their movements and thoughts synchronized by shared hardship. Late one afternoon, with the sky threatening snow and the wind carrying a new, more vicious bite, they stumbled upon a miracle. tucked away in a small, sheltered meadow, almost completely overgrown and hidden by a stand of aspens, was an old, abandoned trapper's cabin. It was a ramshackle structure, its log walls chinked with mud and moss, its roof sagging precariously in the middle. It was barely standing, but it offered 4 walls, a roof, and most importantly, a stone hearth with a chimney. For the first time since their flight began, they could risk a real fire. Inside, the cabin was small and dark, smelling of dust, cold ashes, and the ghosts of long-dead fires. But as Caleb managed to coax a flame to life in the hearth, the little structure was transformed. The flickering firelight pushed back the encroaching darkness, painting the rough log walls in warm, dancing shades of orange and gold. The warmth of the fire was a blessing, a living thing that thawed more than just their frozen limbs. It thawed the fear and tension that had been their constant companions, creating a small, fragile pocket of safety in the vast, hostile wilderness. The cabin, with its single dusty window and its dirt floor, became a sanctuary. That night, they shared another meal of roasted rabbit, but in the warmth and security of the cabin, the simple act felt like a feast. The shared warmth and the relative safety of their shelter created a space for a different kind of vulnerability, a letting down of the guards they had held up for so long. They sat on the floor before the fire, the silence between them no longer a necessity of stealth but a comfortable, shared peace. It was Alara who broke it, her voice soft in the quiet room. "Have you always lived alone, Caleb?" He stared into the flames for a long time before he answered, his face a mask of shadows and light. "Not always." The words were quiet, heavy with unspoken history. He did not give a long speech. His story came out in pieces, in his typical reserved, almost reluctant fashion, each memory a stone he had to turn over before showing it to her. He told her about his mother, a Shoshone woman from the very reservation they were trying to reach. He spoke of her with a deep, quiet reverence. Then he spoke of his father, a white trader who had passed through, a man of easy smiles and empty promises who had abandoned them before Caleb was old enough to remember his face. He spoke of the prejudice he had faced his entire life, the casual cruelty of a world that had no place for him. To the white settlers in the town, he was always the half-breed, an object of suspicion and contempt. To some of his mother's people, he was a constant reminder of a world that was encroaching on theirs, his white blood a stain they could not ignore. He had spent his life on the fringes, never fully belonging to either world. He fell silent then, and Alara thought that was the end of the story. But in the flickering firelight, she saw a new depth of pain in his eyes, a grief so profound it seemed to have settled into the very lines of his face. "There was a time," he began again, his voice even lower now, rough with unshed tears, "when I did not care what the world thought. I had a family." He revealed the core of his tragedy, the wound from which all his sadness and solitude bled. He had met a woman like him, of mixed blood, who understood the loneliness of being caught between two worlds. They had a son. For a few short years, they had carved out a small piece of happiness on a piece of unclaimed land, a place no one else wanted. They were squatters, but they were building a life. But a powerful rancher, a man very much like Silas Croft, with the same hunger for land and the same cold disregard for the lives of others, decided he wanted their valley. He used a trumped-up legal claim, a piece of paper signed by a corrupt official, and a posse of hired guns to enforce it. They came in the middle of a blizzard, in the dead of winter. They had given Caleb's family an hour to leave. They had been driven out into the storm with nothing but the clothes on their backs. His wife and his young son, who was barely 5 years old, had fallen ill from the exposure. The sickness had taken them quickly. He had buried them both on a hillside overlooking the valley that had been stolen from them. That, he explained in a voice devoid of all emotion, was the source of his deep melancholy, the reason for his solitude. It was the reason he had built his walls so high. and the reason for his immediate, visceral hatred of men like Silas Croft. Hearing his story, Ilara's perception of him shifted completely, irrevocably. The stoic, silent protector was gone, and in his place was a man of profound, unimaginable grief. His quietness was not a lack of feeling, but a shield he held up to protect a world of pain. In his story of helplessness against a powerful, cruel man, she saw a dark mirror of her own. She saw the same injustice, the same casual destruction of lives for the sake of greed and pride. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. His skin was calloused and rough, but his hand was warm from the fire. It was a simple gesture of shared humanity, an acknowledgement of his pain that transcended words. He looked at their joined hands, then up at her face, and he did not pull away. That shared vulnerability, that silent acknowledgement of their broken pieces, ignited the simmering attraction that had been building between them since that first night in the hayloft. The intense desire, born of their forced physical proximity and their growing emotional connection, became a palpable, undeniable thing. The air in the tiny, firelit cabin grew thick with unspoken feelings. The way he looked at her then was different. His guard was finally, completely down, and his eyes were filled with a raw, aching tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. He saw her, truly saw her, not as a damsel in distress or a burden he had been forced to take on, but as a woman of incredible resilience and strength, a fellow survivor. The moment that followed was not a sudden, passionate outburst, but a slow, tender, and deeply emotional unfolding. He noticed a small, shallow cut on the back of her hand, a scratch from gathering firewood earlier. He gently turned her hand over in his thumb brushing over the cut. His touch was so gentle, so careful. It seemed impossible that these same hands could be so strong and capable. The look that passed between them was one of profound recognition, a silent conversation in which they saw their own loneliness, their own pain, and their own burgeoning hope reflected in the other's eyes. He leaned in, his movements slow and deliberate, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. The kiss was hesitant at first, a soft, questioning touch of his lips against hers. Then, as she responded, it deepened, and it was filled with all the desperation, fear, loneliness, and fragile hope of their long journey. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated connection in a world that had given them nothing but pain. It was a silent promise that they were not just surviving together anymore, but that they were, perhaps, starting to live again. The details of the moment were etched into her memory. The slight, rough scratch of his beard against her sensitive skin, the faint taste of wood smoke on his lips, the solid, reassuring strength of his arms as they came around her. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the rough wool of his shirt, as if he were the only solid, certain thing in a collapsing world. It was a moment of finding a profound solace, a deep and quiet humanity in each other's arms. Their sanctuary, however, was as fragile as a pane of ice. The next morning, they awoke to a world transformed. A light, silent snow had begun to fall, dusting the landscape in a blanket of pristine white. It seemed beautiful, peaceful. But as Caleb stepped out of the cabin to check the snares, the peacefulness was shattered. He returned moments later, his face grim, the tenderness of the previous night replaced by the cold, hard mask of the survivor. He said nothing, but simply beckoned her to the door. There, in the fresh, untouched snow, not 50 yards from the cabin, was a single set of tracks, the tracks of a lone rider. They were fresh, no more than an hour old. Silas had not sent a large, blundering posse into the mountains. He had done something far more intelligent and far more dangerous. He had sent his best man, a skilled, relentless tracker who knew the mountains as well as Caleb did, Jebediah. The brief respite was over, the tender warmth of the cabin, of their shared confession, of their first kiss, was extinguished as surely as if a bucket of icy water had been thrown on it. The cold reality of the hunt was back, more real and more immediate than ever. They had to leave, now. They had to push deeper and higher into the mountains, into the heart of the coming storm. Caleb moved to the hearth and, with the heel of his boot, began to extinguish the fire, scattering the glowing embers and grinding them into the dirt floor. The last of its warmth, the last of its cheerful, dancing light, vanished into the cold, gray air. They stepped out of the dark, sheltered cabin and back into the harsh, unforgiving light of a winter landscape. They were no longer just running from Silas Croft. They were being actively stalked. But something had fundamentally changed between them. They were no longer two strangers thrown together by chance. They were two souls bound by a shared past of tragedy and a shared, fragile hope for a future. And together, they turned their faces towards the storm. The moment they left the shelter of the trapper's cabin, the nature of their flight changed. They were no longer simply running from a distant threat. They were being actively hunted. The narrative of their journey shifted from one of escape to a tense, nerve-shredding rhythm of cat and mouse. They were the prey, and Jebediah, Silas Croft's relentless foreman, was the predator. His presence was a palpable weight on the air, a shadow that clung to them, turning the vast, beautiful wilderness into a closing trap. The light, gentle snow they had woken to, which at first had seemed a blessing, a soft white blanket to cover their tracks, quickly revealed itself to be a double-edged sword. As the day wore on, the snowfall intensified, growing thicker, heavier, slowing their progress to a grueling plod. The fresh powder made the already treacherous terrain even more perilous, hiding loose rocks and icy patches beneath its pristine surface. But its greatest treachery was the canvas it provided. For a tracker of Jebediah's skill, the unbroken snow was like a freshly written page, and their tracks were a clear and damning signature. Caleb found signs of him everywhere. He would dismount and, after a few moments of studying the ground, would point to a barely disturbed branch where a rider had pushed through. A single, dark cheroot butt dropped in the snow. A set of tracks that showed their pursuer was not just following, but anticipating their movements, cutting across their path to gain ground. He was toying with them, letting them know he was there, letting the fear build. The psychological pressure mounted with each passing hour, a slow, crushing weight. For Alara, the progress she had made, the strength she had discovered in herself, began to crumble. The ever-present threat of Jebediah brought the terror of her wedding night rushing back, the feeling of being cornered, of a powerful, malevolent force closing in with absolute certainty. She found herself looking over her shoulder constantly, her heart leaping into her throat at the snap of a twig or the cry of a distant bird. Caleb was pushed to the very limits of his endurance and his woodcraft. His face became a grim, unreadable mask. His eyes narrowed in constant burning focus. He was no longer just navigating the wilderness. He was engaged in a silent, deadly battle of wits with a man who was very nearly his equal in this environment. He made choices born of desperation, forcing their horse up dangerously steep inclines, pushing through dense, thorny thickets that tore at their clothes and skin, all in an effort to find a path, any path that their hunter could not easily follow. The landscape itself, which had been a passive observer to their plight, now seemed to turn against them, becoming a third antagonist in their desperate struggle. The light snow transformed into a full-blown blizzard. The wind, which had been a constant companion, became a shrieking, violent entity, whipping them with freezing pellets of snow that stung their exposed skin and reduced visibility to a few feet of swirling, blinding white. The world shrank to a maelstrom of snow and wind, a chaotic, disorienting void. Trapped, with Jebediah behind them and the storm raging around them, Caleb made a final, desperate gamble. He pointed towards a dark, jagged shape that loomed out of the swirling snow, a sheer wall of rock that seemed to pierce the very heart of the storm. It was a narrow, icy mountain pass, a place known to his mother's people as the Widow's Needle, a name earned through generations of tragedy. It was a treacherous, near-suicidal route, but it was their only hope of crossing the high ridge before the pass was completely snowed in, trapping them on this side of the mountain with their pursuer, The ascent was a waking nightmare. The trail was barely a foothold wide, slick with ice beneath the ever-deepening snow. The wind howled through the granite spires, threatening to tear them from the mountainside and hurl them into the white abyss below. Their horse, brave and steady until now, became frantic with fear, its eyes rolling, its breath coming in ragged, panicked bursts. Halfway up the pass, the animal's hind legs lost their footing on a patch of black ice. With a terrified scream, it slid sideways, its body dangling over the edge of the ravine, held only by Caleb's desperate grip on the reins. For a heart-stopping moment, they were all poised on the brink of death. The horse's weight was pulling Caleb, and by extension Alara, towards the edge. "Let him go!" Alara screamed over the roar of the wind, her voice laced with terror and a heartbreaking certainty. Caleb's face was a mask of anguish. The horse was his last link to his old life, a companion in his years of solitude. But he knew she was right. With a choked cry, he released the reins. The horse fell, a dark shape swallowed instantly by the swirling whiteness below. The sound of its final, terrified cry was lost in the fury of the storm. The sacrifice was heartbreaking, but it was necessary. They were now on foot, alone and terribly exposed, from the supplies in his saddlebags, which he had managed to cut free before letting the horse go. Caleb retrieved a length of old, scavenged rope from the trapper's cabin. He tied one end around Alara's waist and the other around his own. They were bound together, their fates now inextricably physically linked. Their shared struggle became a testament to the bond that had been forged between them. They moved as one entity, a single, desperate life force against the overwhelming power of the mountain and the storm. Every step was a battle. They climbed, crawled, and clawed their way upward, their hands raw and bleeding, their lungs burning from the thin, freezing air. When Alara's strength failed, when her legs would no longer obey her commands, Caleb would half carry, half drag her forward, and when his own resolve wavered in the face of the storm's relentless assault, her quiet, fierce determination, her simple, stubborn refusal to give up, gave him the strength to take another step. Their dialogue was sparse, reduced to the bare essentials, shouted over the roar of the wind. "Step here! Hold tight! Do not look down!" Simple commands and words of encouragement, a lifeline of sound in the white chaos. They reached the summit of the pass in a state of near-total exhaustion, collapsing into the meager shelter of a jagged outcropping of rock. They had made it. For a single, fleeting moment, a sense of triumphant relief washed over them. And then, the moment was shattered. Like an apparition materializing from the swirling snow, a figure appeared before them. It was Jebediah. He had taken a riskier, more direct route up the face of the cliff, a climb only a madman or a truly desperate hunter would attempt. He stood not 20 feet away, a heavy rifle held loosely in his hands, a cruel, triumphant smirk twisting his frost-rimmed beard. And he was not alone. A second figure, another of Croft's men, emerged from the blizzard behind him. They were cornered. This was not a scene from a dime novel, not a typical Western shootout with men drawing their pistols at high noon. This was a brutal, desperate confrontation in a hostile, alien environment, a fight for survival at the frozen top of the world. Jebediah's laugh was a harsh, grating sound, snatched away by the wind. He seemed to be enjoying this moment, savoring his victory. "Nowhere left to run, half-breed," he spat, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred. He turned his gaze to Alara, who was huddled behind Caleb, her face pale with a mixture of terror and defiance. "And you, Mrs. Croft, the boss is mighty displeased. He does not want you back as a wife anymore. Seems your little adventure has made you unsuitable. But he does want you back. He wants to make an example of you. He wants everyone to see what happens to his property when it tries to run away." His words were a physical blow, stripping away any last foolish hope that she could appeal to Silas's mercy. "As for your protector here," Jebediah continued, raising his rifle slightly, "the boss wants him alive, but he did not say in how many pieces." It was in that moment, with Jebediah's cruel words echoing in her ears, that something inside Alara finally, irrevocably snapped. The victim who had fled in the night, the survivor who had endured the wilderness, was consumed and replaced by the fighter, while Jebediah's attention was focused on Caleb, whom he clearly saw as the only real threat. Alara's eyes darted around their small patch of rock. She saw a loose slab of stone, about the size of a loaf of bread, resting precariously near the edge of a small incline. Using the element of surprise, fueled by a surge of pure, unadulterated rage, she lunged forward and shoved the rock with all her might. It tumbled down the short, icy slope. Not a deadly attack, but a diversion. It struck the second man in the shins, causing him to cry out in pain and lose his footing. His own rifle, which he had been raising, discharged with a deafening crack, the shot going wild, echoing strangely in the muffled air of the blizzard. That small act of defiance, that single second of chaos, was the only opening Caleb needed. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was terrifying to behold, launching himself not at his gun, but directly at Jebediah. The two men collided with a grunt of impact and tumbled into the snow, a desperate, tangled struggle of fists, knives, and brute force. It was not heroic or noble. It was ugly, primitive, and brutally real. Caleb fought with a cold, silent fury, all the pain of his past, all his trauma, all his burning hatred for men like Silas Croft and their enforcers, channeled into this one, violent explosion. They rolled in the snow, punching and grappling, their grunts and curses lost to the wind. Alara watched in horror, her heart pounding. The second man, recovering his balance, was trying to bring his rifle to bear on the struggling forms, but the fight was too chaotic. Caleb and Jebediah too entangled for a clear shot. Then, the sickeningly familiar crack of a gunshot echoed across the summit again. This time, not a wild shot. Caleb's body went rigid. A pained grunt was forced from his lips. He faltered, his attack losing its momentum. A dark stain, shockingly red against the pure white snow, began to spread across the side of his coat. He had been shot. Jebediah, sensing his advantage, pressed his attack. Gaining the upper hand, he pinned Caleb to the ground, his larger frame overpowering the wounded man. He raised his fist, preparing to deliver a final, crushing blow. "No!" The scream was torn from Alara's throat. With a surge of adrenaline she did not know she possessed, she grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a heavy, broken tree branch, frozen and solid as a club. She scrambled across the icy ground and, with all her strength, swung it, smashing it against the back of Jebediah's head. There was a sickening thud, and the big foreman collapsed sideways, stunned, his eyes rolling back in his head. The immediate aftermath was a moment of shocked, ringing silence, broken only by the incessant howling wind. The second man, his face a mask of disbelief, finally raised his rifle. But Caleb, moving through a haze of pain, was faster. He rolled, retrieved his own pistol from its holster, and fired. The man crumpled to the ground without a sound, a second dark shape in the endless white. They had won, but the cost was severe. Caleb lay in the snow, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, his hand pressed against the bleeding wound in his side. He was growing weaker by the minute. The blizzard, as if enraged by the violence, intensified its assault. The snow falling faster, the wind shrieking with a new fury. They were trapped at the highest point of the pass, miles from any shelter, with a dying man and a rising storm. They huddled together behind the same outcropping of rock, a space barely large enough to shield them from the worst of the wind. Alara, her hands shaking but her movements surprisingly steady, tore strips from the bottom of her own wool shirt. She gently pushed Caleb's hand away from the wound and pressed the makeshift bandage against it, trying to staunch the flow of blood. His blood was so stark, so shockingly red, against the pure, indifferent white of the snow. It was here, in this frozen, desolate purgatory, that the story's central emotional climax unfolded. Caleb, his face pale and beaded with a mixture of sweat and melting snow, looked up at her. He believed he was dying, and in the face of that certainty, his stoic, lifelong reserve finally broke. completely and utterly. His eyes, usually so guarded and unreadable, were now wide open, full of pain and a fierce, desperate love. "Ilara," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper above the wind. He reached up, his bloody fingers touching her cheek. "I do not regret it. Helping you." He took a shuddering breath. These last few days, even like this, they have had more life in them than all my years of being alone, more meaning. His eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw his entire, broken, beautiful soul. "I love you," he confessed. It was not a romantic declaration whispered in a quiet, safe moment. It was a final, vital truth, spoken at what he believed was the end of his life. Tears streamed down Ilara's face, freezing on her cheeks. She responded with an equal desperate intensity, her own heart breaking. "Do not say that," she sobbed, clinging to him. "You cannot die. Caleb, you cannot. You were the first person, the only person, who ever saw me. Not what I could be for them, but just me." Her own confession tumbled out, a torrent of emotion she could no longer contain. "I love you too." She pressed her face to his, her warmth a futile but desperate attempt to keep him tethered to life. They kissed then, a kiss of desperation, love, and a potential final goodbye. His lips were cold, but there was still life in them. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a final act of defiance against the beautiful, deadly indifference of the storm that raged around them. The part ended on a cliffhanger, a moment of absolute despair. Caleb's eyes fluttered closed, his head growing heavy in her lap. The life seemed to be draining out of him, his warmth seeping away into the frozen ground. Ilara was alone, wounded and exhausted, high in a mountain pass with the man she loved dying in her arms as the blizzard howled, threatening to bury them both in a silent, white grave. All hope seemed to be lost. It was the darkest, most desolate moment of their long and desperate journey. The world had dissolved into a maelstrom of white noise and blinding snow. The howling of the wind was the only sound, a final, lonely keen for the end of all things. Ilara cradled Caleb's head in her lap, his lifeblood a stark, terrible stain upon her clothes and the snow around them. His warmth was fading, seeping out of him, and the cold was a predator, sinking its teeth into her own flesh, pulling her down into a lethargic, hopeless despair. She was succumbing, her grief and exhaustion a heavy blanket threatening to smother her last spark of defiance. This was how it ended, she thought, not with a bang, but with a whisper of wind and a slow, inexorable freezing. Just as her own eyelids grew heavy, just as the darkness at the edge of her vision began to close in, a shape emerged from the blinding chaos. It was tall and broad, a figure made of snow and shadow, moving with a steady, unhurried gait that seemed to defy the storm's fury. Her first thought was that it was another of Croft's men, a final specter come to witness their demise. Her heart seized with a final, useless jolt of terror. But this figure was different. He was not an enemy. He wore buckskins and a heavy buffalo hide coat, and he carried not a rifle, but a long ashwood bow. He stopped a few feet away, his dark, weathered face a mask of calm assessment, his eyes, deep-set and intelligent, taking in the entire grim tableau, the two dead men, the wounded man bleeding out in the snow, and the half-frozen woman clinging to him. He was an old Shoshone hunter, a man whose name was Tarak, and he moved through the mountains as if he were a part of them. He had been tracking a bighorn sheep higher up the pass when the sharp, unnatural crack of the gunshots had carried to him on the wind, drawing him to this scene of violence and despair. He looked at Caleb, and a flicker of recognition, or perhaps something deeper, a kinship of the soul, passed through his eyes. He saw the high cheekbones, the straight black hair, the cast of the man's features. He saw a man of two worlds, a man like the son of the woman he had known long ago, a friend of his family. He saw a man who belonged here in the mountains, but who was dying because of the troubles of the world below. Tarek was a man of few words and immense practical knowledge. He wasted no time on questions or exclamations. He knelt, his movements economical and sure, and placed a hand on Caleb's neck, feeling for the faint, thready pulse. He looked at the wound, his expression grim but not hopeless. Then he looked at Alara, his gaze direct and piercing, and in that gaze, she found a tiny, impossible glimmer of hope. With a series of gestures and a few softly spoken words in his own tongue, which she did not understand but whose meaning was perfectly clear, he conveyed his plan. They could not stay here. They had to move. He used his hunting knife to cut saplings from a stunted, wind-blasted pine, and together, with numb and clumsy fingers, Alara helped him fashion a makeshift travois, lacing the frame with the rope that had so recently bound her to Caleb. Getting Caleb onto the travois was an agonizing effort. He was a dead weight, his body limp and unresponsive, and every movement seemed to cause him a fresh wave of pain, drawing a low moan from his pale lips. Finally, they secured him, and Tarek harnessed himself to the front of the crude sledge. They began the slow, torturous descent down the other side of the mountain, away from Silas Croft's territory, away from the Widow's Needle, and towards a place of sanctuary Tarek knew of, a hidden winter encampment of his small, nomadic band. The journey to the camp was a trial by fire, a crucible that burned away the last remnants of the woman Alara had been. She was forced to find a deep well of resilience she never knew she possessed. The frightened bride who had fled in terror was gone forever, replaced by a survivor, a woman driven by the fierce, primal need to save the man she loved. She walked beside the travois, her hand often resting on Caleb's chest, as if she could will her own strength into him. She helped Tarek navigate the treacherous, snow-choked paths, her eyes scanning the terrain for dangers. When they stopped for brief, exhausted rests, she would gather what little dry wood she could find, knowing that a fire, however small, was life. She tended to Caleb's worsening wound, fighting to keep his fever down. His skin was hot to the touch, and he had begun to murmur in delirium. She packed clean snow against his forehead, using the last of her torn shirt to hold it in place. At night, when the temperature dropped to truly deadly levels, she would lie beside him under the buffalo robe Tarek had given them, sharing her own dwindling body heat, whispering to him, begging him to hold on, to fight. After 2 days that felt like an eternity, they arrived at the Shoshone camp. It was a place of impossible beauty and life, nestled in a deep, geothermal valley, a secret pocket of warmth in the frozen landscape. Plumes of steam rose from natural hot springs, melting the snow on the ground and nurturing patches of green grass. The air was warmer here, protected from the worst of the wind by the high valley walls. A small collection of hide lodges, or teepees, were arranged in a semicircle, smoke curling lazily from their peaks. It was a vision of peace, a world away from the violence they had escaped. But their arrival was not met with open arms. The community, a small band of no more than 30 souls, emerged from their lodges, their faces wary and suspicious. They were a people who had learned through bitter experience that outsiders, especially white outsiders, brought nothing but trouble. Alara, with her pale skin and her strange, tattered clothes, was an object of immediate and intense distrust. They looked at her, then at the half-conscious man on the travois, and their expressions hardened. Caleb's half-white heritage, which had made him an outcast in one world, now made his position precarious in this one as well. It was Tarek who spoke for them. He stood before the others and spoke in their own language, his voice calm and steady, recounting the story of what he had found on the mountain pass. He spoke for a long time, his words weaving a tale of violence, desperation, and a debt of honor to the memory of Caleb's mother. Finally, an elderly woman stepped forward. She was the matriarch of the group, a medicine woman whose name was Singing Aspen. Her face was a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, and her dark eyes held a wisdom that seemed as ancient as the mountains themselves. She approached the travois and looked down at Caleb, her gaze sharp and assessing. She placed a gnarled hand on his fevered brow, then gently peeled back Alara's crude bandage to examine the wound. After a long, silent moment, she looked at Tarak and gave a single, curt nod. She would tend to him. The healing process was long and arduous. Caleb was carried into Singing Aspen's lodge, a warm, dim space that smelled of sage, pine smoke, and drying herbs. For days, he drifted in the gray, twilight world between life and death. His fever raged, and his dreams were haunted, filled with fragmented images of his lost family, of the blizzard that had taken them, and of Alara's face, her eyes wide with terror in the hayloft. Alara rarely left his side. She sat on a pile of soft furs in the corner of the lodge, a silent, watchful presence. Singing Aspen, seeing the fierce devotion in the young woman's eyes, began to teach her. Alara learned how to grind herbs into a poultice to fight the infection, how to brew a bitter tea from willow bark to combat the fever, how to simmer a thin, nourishing broth from bone and roots to give him strength. Her hands, once soft and accustomed only to embroidery, grew stained and calloused, but they also grew sure and steady. During the long days and nights of Caleb's recovery, Alara slowly, painstakingly, began to earn the community's trust. She did not do it with words, for she did not speak their language and they had little interest in hers. She did it through her actions. When she was not needed in the sick lodge, she worked. She helped the other women with their chores, mending clothes with an awl and sinew, scraping hides, hauling water from the hot springs in heavy clay pots, preparing food. She did it all without complaint, with a quiet humility and a deep, genuine respect for their customs and their quiet way of life. She formed a tentative, unspoken bond with Singing Aspen. The old medicine woman saw the strength and the unwavering love in Alara, and she began to share her wisdom. In the evenings, as they sat by the fire, Singing Aspen would tell her stories, in a mixture of her own tongue and broken English. She told Alara of the Shoshone's own struggles, of how men like Silas Croft, the land eaters as she called them, had been stealing their ancestral lands for generations, rerouting their water sources, and killing the buffalo, slowly strangling their way of life. Alara listened, and she began to understand that her own tragedy was not an isolated event, but a single thread in a much larger tapestry of greed and injustice. This period of quiet reflection and hard work was a time of profound transformation for Alara, in this small community that lived in close, harsh harmony with the land. She found a sense of purpose and belonging she had never felt in the stilted drawing rooms and false society of her past. She came to realize that true strength was not about wealth or power or ornate dresses. It was about community, about resilience, about a quiet, unyielding integrity. It was about knowing how to survive, not just for oneself, but for the sake of others. As Caleb's fever finally broke and he began the slow journey back to consciousness and strength, their relationship deepened and matured. The frantic, desperate desperation of their flight was replaced by a quiet, steady intimacy. When he was strong enough to sit up, they would talk for hours, their voices low in the peaceful quiet of the lodge. They shared their dreams for a future they had not dared to imagine, and their fears of a past that still haunted them. They were no longer just two people clinging to each other for survival. They were carefully, tenderly, building the foundations of a shared life. One afternoon, when he was strong enough to walk with her help, they went to one of the more secluded hot springs at the edge of the valley. The steam rose around them, creating a private, ethereal world. There, in the warm, healing water, she helped him bathe his wound. The bullet had torn through the muscle in his side, leaving an ugly, puckered scar. Her touch was infinitely gentle as she cleaned the wound, her fingers tracing the evidence of their shared trauma. It was a moment of quiet sensuality and profound emotional connection, a healing of both the body and the soul. They were no longer defined by their scars, but by the love that had grown around them. But they both knew that this peaceful valley was a temporary sanctuary, not a permanent home. They realized that running forever was not a life. They could not hide in this valley forever. And more importantly, they could not ignore the fact that the injustice that Silas Croft represented was not just their problem. It was a cancer that continued to fester, harming not just them, but the good people who had saved them. Their desire for survival had evolved into a burning need for justice. The turning point, the moment that galvanized their quiet resolve into a concrete plan, came when Tarak and the other hunters returned from a scouting trip. The news they brought was grim. Croft's men, frustrated in their search for the fugitives in the mountains, had turned their anger and suspicion on the surrounding native communities. They were harassing people on the reservation, blaming them for harboring Caleb and Alara, and in an act of calculated cruelty, they had built a dam on the crucial river that flowed from the mountains, the river that the Shoshone depended on for their winter survival. They were cutting off the water, threatening to turn this small, vibrant valley into a frozen wasteland. Caleb and Alara listened, and a heavy, shared guilt settled over them. They were the cause of this new aggression. They could no longer think only of protecting themselves. They now had a profound responsibility to the people who had given them shelter. It was Singing Aspen who gave them the weapon they needed. That night, she told them an old story, a rumor that had been passed down among her people. It was the story of a ghost ledger, a book that had been kept by a disgruntled former clerk of Croft's, a man with a conscience who had been horrified by his employer's crimes. The clerk had meticulously documented everything, all of Croft's illegal land grabs, his fraudulent claims on water rights, his tactics of intimidation and violence. The clerk, the story went, had been silenced and had disappeared years ago, but the ledger was rumored to still exist, hidden somewhere in the town of Redemption, the very town that Silas Croft owned and controlled. The part ended not with a flight, but with a decision, a new plan, forged in the quiet of the lodge, born of responsibility and a thirst for justice. They would not run any further. They would not hide while others suffered for them. Armed with the knowledge of the ledger and the quiet support of their new allies, they decided to return, to walk back into the heart of the danger. Their goal was no longer just to escape Silas Croft. It was to find that ledger, to expose him, and to destroy his empire of fear at its very root. It was an almost suicidal mission, a journey back into the lion's den, but it was the only path to true freedom, not just for them, but for everyone living under Silas Croft's long, dark shadow. The journey back down from the high mountains was a stark and solemn procession, profoundly different from their desperate flight. They were no longer fleeing, they were advancing. Their direction was reversed, their purpose transformed. Fear had been replaced by a cold, hard resolve that felt heavier and more solid than any fear had ever been. They were accompanied by Tarak and two other silent, watchful Shoshone warriors, men whose faces were as unreadable as the granite cliffs they left behind. These men were not just guides, they were allies, bound to their cause by the shared enemy who was now threatening their own survival. Caleb rode a horse borrowed from the Shoshone, his body still weak from his injury, a permanent ache in his side, a constant reminder of how close they had come to death. But the weakness in his body was belied by a new strength in his eyes. The profound sadness was still there, but it was now overlaid with a steely, unwavering determination. Beside him rode Alara. She was no longer the terrified passenger clinging to his back, but an equal partner in their dangerous enterprise. Her face, thinned by hardship and tanned by the wind and sun, was set with a quiet determination that mirrored his own. She had been forged into something new in the crucible of the wilderness, and she was returning to face her tormentor not as a victim, but as an agent of justice. They reached the outskirts of the town of Redemption under the cover of a thick gray dusk, just as the annual winter festival was reaching its chaotic peak. The town, from a distance, was a cheerful sight, its streets strung with lanterns and garlands, the sound of music and raucous laughter spilling from the saloons. But they knew it was a facade, a thin veneer of prosperity and celebration built upon the corrupt foundation of Silas Croft's power. Beneath the festive cheer lay an undercurrent of fear and oppression, as palpable as the biting cold in the air. Disguised in plain, borrowed clothes, a simple calico dress for Ilara, a worn canvas coat and shapeless hat for Caleb, they slipped into the crowded streets, moving like ghosts through the throng. Their senses were on high alert, every drunken shout, every passing shadow a potential threat. Tarak and his men melted away into the darkness, their task to watch and wait, to be a silent, unseen line of support. Their mission was twofold, a desperate gamble with their lives as the stakes, find the ghost ledger, and then find a way to make its damning contents known to the world. They knew they had to split up. Caleb, using his knowledge of the town's grimy underbelly from a life lived in its shadows, went to seek out contacts from his past. He sought men who hated Silas Croft as much as he did, but who had always been too afraid, or too isolated, to act. He found his man in the smoke and ringing steel of the blacksmith shop, an old, bitter man named Elias Thorne, whose small farm had withered and died years ago after Croft had illegally and systematically stolen his water rights. Thorne was a man consumed by a slow-burning, helpless rage. At first, he was suspicious, his eyes narrowed and hostile, but as Caleb spoke, his voice low and earnest, laying out their desperate plan, the blacksmith saw the sincerity in his quest. He saw a chance, however slim, not just for revenge, but for a justice he had long ago given up on. After a long, tense silence, broken only by the hiss of hot iron in the quenching tub, Thorne agreed. He would help create the diversion they needed. Ilara's task was infinitely more dangerous. Based on the rumors the Shoshone elders had shared, the ledger was hidden somewhere in Croft's private study, in the very ranch house from which she had fled. She had to get inside. She used the festival as her cover, pulling a heavy shawl over her head and carrying a large, covered basket. She approached the main house, a place of looming, nightmarish memories, and joined a group of local women who had been hired to bring extra food for the large party Croft was hosting. The scene inside the house was one of controlled opulence, even more grand than she remembered. The air was thick with the familiar, suffocating scents of expensive cigars and whiskey. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She had to force herself to breathe, to keep her head down, to appear as just another anonymous servant. The psychological weight of being back in this place, so close to her tormentor, was immense. And then she saw him. He was standing by the great stone fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand, holding court with a group of fawning businessmen and ranchers. He looked exactly the same, handsome, powerful, his eyes as cold and empty as ever. For a heart-stopping moment, their eyes met across the crowded room. She froze, certain he would recognize her, but he did not. His gaze swept over her without a flicker of recognition, dismissing her as just another part of the scenery, an insignificant piece of the world he owned. The fact that he did not see her, did not recognize the woman who was once to be his wife, both terrified and emboldened her. She forced her feet to move, carrying her basket towards the kitchens, her mind racing, while Silas was distracted by his guests, playing the part of the generous host. She slipped away from the bustling kitchen and down a quiet, darkened hallway towards his private study. The door was unlocked. She slipped inside, her heart in her throat. The room was exactly as she imagined it, an extension of Silas himself. It was opulent, with dark, heavy furniture, shelves of leather-bound books that looked as though they had never been read, and a massive oak desk, its surface orderly and bare. The room was suffocating, the air still and cold. Following the elder's instructions, she went to the large, imposing portrait of Silas's father that hung over the mantelpiece. Her fingers, trembling slightly, searched the edge of the heavy gold frame. She found it, a small, hidden latch. She pressed it, and with a soft click, a section of the wall beside the fireplace swung inward, revealing a small, secret compartment. and there it was, a thick, leather-bound ledger. Her hands shook as she lifted it. It was heavier than she expected, heavy with the weight of years of secrets and crimes. She opened it, and her breath caught. Page after page was filled with a clerk's neat, meticulous script, documenting dates, names, and sums. It was all there: the fraudulent land claims, the intimidation of smaller ranchers, the stolen water rights, including a precise entry detailing the theft from Elias Thorne, all the hidden, ugly truths upon which Silas Croft had built his empire. Just as she was closing the book, a sound from the doorway made her blood run cold. "I wondered when you might finally come home." Silas stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light from the hall. He had recognized her after all. Or perhaps he had simply been alerted that a servant had gone where she did not belong. The confrontation she had dreaded was upon her. It was a chilling battle of wills. He was no longer playing the part of the suitor or the offended husband. His true, monstrous nature was finally, fully revealed. He was unnervingly calm, a cruel, predatory smile playing on his lips. "Did you really think you could escape me?" he said, his voice a low, mocking purr. He took a step into the room, his eyes fixed on the ledger in her hands. "That book is meaningless. I own this town. I own the sheriff. I own the judge who is sleeping in my guest room right now. Everyone has a price. Ilara. And I have paid it." He took another step, his intentions clear. He was going to take the book, and he was going to take her. "You are my wife. You will learn to accept that." He lunged for her, his hand reaching out to grab her, but she was no longer the terrified, helpless girl who had fled his bedroom. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a white-hot, righteous fury. She fought back. With a strength born of desperation and rage, she swung the heavy ledger with both hands, smashing it against the side of his head. The impact was solid, satisfying. He staggered back with a cry of pain and surprise, his hand flying to his temple. It was not enough to disable him, but it was enough. It gave her the 1 second she needed. She did not hesitate. Clutching the ledger to her chest, she ran from the room, past the stunned and bleeding Silas Croft, and into the hallway. "Stop her!" he bellowed, his voice no longer calm, but raw with fury. The alarm was raised. The climax of their desperate gamble unfolded across the entire town. Ilara burst from a side door of the ranch house and ran, her lungs burning, the sounds of shouting men and barking dogs erupting behind her. At that exact moment, across town, a pillar of smoke began to rise into the night sky. Caleb and Elias Thorne had started their diversion. A pile of damp hay and old lumber in the livery stable was now smoldering, creating a plume of thick, black smoke that looked far more dangerous than it actually was. The town's fire bell began to clang, and Croft's men, torn between the alarm at the ranch and the fire in the town, were thrown into chaos. In the ensuing confusion, Caleb and Tarek intercepted Ilara at the edge of the town square, just as Croft's men were beginning to organize a pursuit. "Did you get it?" Caleb asked, his eyes burning with intensity. She held up the ledger, her chest heaving. "We have to run!" "No," Caleb said, his voice firm. He pointed not towards the darkness of the plains, but towards the tall, white steeple of the town church, its windows glowing warmly in the night. "We run there." It was the one place Silas Croft's power was an illusion. The church was considered a sanctuary, and tonight it was also a courthouse. The traveling circuit judge, an honorable man with a reputation for fearing no one but God, was using the church hall to hear local disputes, and most of the townspeople were gathered there, drawn by the festival and the rare presence of the law. They burst through the heavy oak doors of the church, causing a wave of shocked gasps from the assembled crowd. They ran down the center aisle, past the stunned faces of their neighbors, and stopped before the judge, who sat at a simple wooden table at the front. "Judge, a moment of your time," Caleb said, his voice ringing with an authority no one in this town had ever heard from him. He placed the ledger on the table before the judge. "This book contains the truth about Silas Croft." Just then, Silas himself stormed into the church, his face a mask of fury, a trickle of blood dried on his temple. His men fanned out behind him, blocking the doors. A tense, dramatic standoff ensued in the house of God. "These are criminals, Your Honor," Silas declared, his voice booming with its usual arrogance. "A runaway wife and a half-breed thief. That book is a forgery, a lie they have concocted to save their own skins." But his foundation of fear, so carefully constructed over decades, had begun to crumble. Emboldened by this open act of defiance, a voice rose from the crowd. It was Elias Thorne, the blacksmith, his face smudged with soot from the diversion. "It is no lie," he shouted. "He stole my water. The book will prove it." Then another voice, a rancher whose land had been stolen through a fraudulent claim. Then a woman whose husband had been beaten by Croft's men. One by one, the people of redemption, who had suffered in silence for so long, began to speak out, their individual voices rising into a chorus of accusation, each story corroborating the damning evidence in the ledger the judge was now reading with a grim expression. The final tragedy struck in the chaos of that moment. Silas Croft, seeing his empire of fear collapsing around him, seeing the hatred in the eyes of the people he had terrorized for so long, was consumed by a final, desperate act of malevolent violence. He pulled a small, concealable pistol from his coat. He did not aim for Caleb, the man who had orchestrated his downfall. In a last, possessive, hateful act, he aimed for Alara. "If I cannot have you," he screamed, "no one will." He fired. The shot was a deafening explosion in the enclosed space, but the bullet did not find its target. Tarak, the old Shoshone hunter who had saved them on the mountain, who had stood silently at the back of the church, moved with a speed that defied his age. He threw himself in front of Alara. The bullet struck him square in the chest. Tarak collapsed to the floor. Caleb caught him, lowering him gently to the ground. The old hunter looked up at Caleb, a faint, peaceful smile on his lips, before his eyes went vacant. He died in Caleb's arms, a selfless, noble sacrifice that shattered the last vestiges of fear in the town and galvanized everyone against Silas Croft. In the ensuing struggle, as the townspeople surged forward, Caleb subdued the screaming, raving Silas. But he did not kill him. He chose justice over vengeance. He hauled the broken man to his feet and handed him over to the circuit judge. The aftermath was quiet and profoundly bittersweet. Silas Croft was taken into custody, his empire shattered by the simple, undeniable power of the truth. The town of redemption began the slow, difficult process of healing, of learning to live without the shadow that had loomed over them for so long. And Tarak was mourned, a quiet hero, by his own people and by the town he had inadvertently helped to free. The final scene took place weeks later. The first tentative signs of spring were beginning to thaw the harsh Wyoming landscape. The snow was retreating, and the frozen earth was softening, ready for new life. Caleb and Alara stood on the small plot of land that was Caleb's homestead. They were standing on a small hill that overlooked the valley, a place where the wind always seemed to whisper through the pines. They had buried Tarak here, marking his grave with a simple pile of river stones, honoring the memory of the man who had given his life for them. The future was still uncertain. They were both scarred, inside and out, by what they had endured. The world was still a hard and often unforgiving place. Society, with its neat boxes and its cruel prejudices, might never fully accept them, the quiet half-breed outcast and the notorious runaway bride. But they had found their own society, their own world, in each other. They were free, and they were together. The story ended not with a wedding or a grand declaration of a happily ever after, but with a simple, quiet moment that was more powerful than either. The sun was setting, painting the bruised sky in familiar shades of orange and purple. Caleb reached out and took Alara's hand. His touch, which had once been that of a stranger, was now as familiar and comforting as her own heartbeat. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and together they watched the sun sink behind the jagged peaks of the Owl Creek Mountains, The same mountains that had nearly killed them, but had also, in their cruel and beautiful way, forged their love. They had survived the tragedy, they had found their justice, and they had earned their small, precious glimmer of hope. Their love story was not a fairy tale, but something far more real, more resilient, and more beautiful, etched forever into the heart of the wild, unforgiving, and magnificent West. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the campfire. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.